Good afternoon, and welcome to the Wednesday afternoon conference call with Trusts Unlimited. This is Jim George speaking. I'm the non-attorney spokesman and facilitator for Trusts Unlimited, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this call, particularly those of you calling in for the first time and those that will be listening to the replay over the next 24 to 48 hours. We like to move quickly through these calls. Today's call is going to be just a little different than what I had anticipated. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on the phone, unfortunately, my daughter was in a rather severe car accident. She was released from the hospital a few days ago, and since it's her birthday, I decided to travel to Nashville to spend some time with her. Family comes first for us. And since I happen to have 5 daughters, life can be complicated at times. But I'm happy to be here with her. But as I'm on a laptop, I'm just not very good with this thing. This call is going to be a little different because I'm going to be touching on a lot of things that are involved in the revaluation of these currencies, what's going on globally, and how it's going to affect us beyond just the exchange of these currencies and how we're going to manage these funds as we proceed. We did not see the reinstitution of the dinar in January as I had anticipated and hoped, largely because they did not get the government in place. That had primarily was the result of the fact that individuals were challenging the election. They had no case. It was just a Hail Mary. Fortunately, the courts in Iraq acted independently, looked at the information, and went ahead and certified the election. So now we can proceed. So let's talk a little bit about what's going in Parliament right now. They are preparing for the upcoming session, dealing with a number of things. One is the selection of the President of the Republic, who is actually the person that presides over the Parliament. Beyond that, they have to select the Prime Minister. I would be surprised if it's not either Kazemi or someone of his ilk. The Kurds and the Sadrists are trying to resolve their issues and unite the Sunnis. There is one good piece of news here, even though those talks have been a little bit stalled, is that they're kind of in agreement that the most radical Shia faction, led by Maliki, is pretty much out. So hopefully it's the end of that guy because he's been a problem for over a decade. The Parliament's also established something called a coordinating framework to proceed with a change in the exchange rate. And they are allegedly collecting parliamentary signatures, which signatures I would assume are going to be presented to the Finance Committee and subsequently presented to the CBI. Now, that's a good thing, but it's all window dressing because the CBI has the unilateral authority to change the exchange rate. There are opposing views, however, they're legitimate views about what the change in the exchange rate actually means. One group believes that what's going to happen is they're merely going to go back to the 1190 rate from the 1450 rate. And they cite as the rationale for that the money supply and the lack of a diverse economic revenue base, both of which I think I've addressed pretty clearly. And I'll point to my calls of January 19th and January 26th, where I dealt, it was February 19th no, let me check my log here. Yeah, I'm sorry. January 19th and January 26th, I believe, were the 2 calls that dealt with the issues of the money supply and diversification of economic revenue. So I would go back and kind of review those calls. Incidentally, for those calling in for the first time, I would strongly suggest after this call you go to our call of December 1st of last year, because that's a detailed call of the turnkey program we put in place to assist you, and a lot of other relevant information. I'm going to get into the trust today, but I'm going to get into a different aspect of it because as we move closer to this reinstatement and revaluation, we're going to have to deal with the central banks and what they're planning to do, because it seems to me the more I look into this, the more they are going to try to figure out a way to control this wealth and not allow us, as we should, to have complete control of this wealth. Now, as I said, because I digress a little bit, going back to these opposing views, one view is that the exchange rate's merely going to be to go back to the 1190 rate from the 1450 rate. The second view, and the one that I believe, and of course it's wishful thinking as well as my belief, that we're going to go either to the 1190 and then to a reinstituted rate, or we're going to go right into a reinstituted rate, again, because, as I stated, I did address the money supply and diversification of economic revenue, but there are other things going on that kind of don't make sense if they're just going to go to 1190 for, say, calendar year 2022. First, the statement that the lower denoms are in possession of all 8 regional banks. Now, of course, they've been there for some time, but that was an expensive proposition, and for them to mention that again must mean something. Second, if they're only going to go to the 1190 rate, why is the CBI establishing bank branches throughout the Middle East and the European nations? That makes no sense, because if they're going to stay with the 1190 rate, the only way they can proceed with international contracts is by using their reserve currency, and if they're going to use a reserve currency, they can transact globally through the Bank of International Settlements. They don't need these bank branches. So, in my view, it does not make sense to establish all of these bank branches unless you're anticipating the reinstitution and revaluation of your own currency. So at the end of the day, in my opinion, what's going on is that there are still some people in positions of influence who, for their own reasons, want the reinstatement and the revaluation of the Iraqi dinar, and for that matter, the adjustment of a lot of other currencies to be either postponed or stopped. I do not think in the end that they're going to prevail, but I do think there's still some folks out there, again, for their own personal and political reasons and financial reasons, that just do not want this thing to proceed. Now, I want to mention one other thing, because it may have some effect. For those of us that have been involved in this for any length of time, we remember that the reinstitution of the dinar was possible all the way back in 2012. And in my opinion, it was Obama and Maliki, again, for their own personal and political reasons, stopped that. The problem we have now is Joe Biden. The guy's just awful. I don't care what your politics are. If you don't like what I'm saying, just hang up, because you're going to hear it. This guy has done more damage in the last year than any president in any 4 years in my lifetime. We've lost Afghanistan. We're in the process of losing the Ukraine. I don't even want to get into the domestic issues. But now Biden has a great idea for Iraq. He thinks they should partition it into 3 sections. This is after years of trying to bring the country together. His solution is just to break it up. Now, this was tried before in the early 90s by Bill Clinton in Yugoslavia. What ended up with the creation of, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Croatia? A war. And Kosovo, we ended up in a war. And, Biden is nothing but an obstruction and a complication. So I hope they do not consider what he's saying, because it's going to, put the kibosh on everything. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that his honeymoon is over, and everyone's pretty clear on who this guy is. Again, I know there are people that are Dinarians that are kind enough to listen to this that disagree politically, but this is my airtime, and so I'm going to tell you what I think. And the guy's not been helpful by any metric. Now, on our calls, particularly the call of December 1st that I mentioned that goes into our call in detail, we go into detail about why you need to establish your trust prior to the revaluation. But that only deals with those of us who have currencies or have an asset that we think is going to appreciate substantially. We want to get the asset out of personal title and into a trust for all of the reasons that are discussed in detail on that call. But now there are other reasons to establish a trust, whether you have currencies or not, but particularly if you have currencies. So I'm going to have to get into the weeds a little bit here, and I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is to read from other transcripts and things. But it's important you understand what's happening because it's going to affect all of us whether you have currencies or not. First, I want to talk about the Constitution, and I want to talk about one section of the Constitution to begin with. Article 1, Section 8, quote, Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and a foreign coin. Section 10, Article 1, Section 10. Note, quote, no state shall make anything but gold or silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Section 10, Clause 1, there shall be no law impairing the obligation of contracts or grant any title of nobility, unquote. Now, what does this mean? It means, number one, that the federal government has the authority and the right to print our currency. It belongs to the people. And number two, we as citizens have the right to contract. Now, why are these two important? Let me read one other thing here. Supreme case, Lochner versus New York, which confirmed the right of the citizens to establish contracts. This trust is a contract, and I'm going to explain to you why this contract is important. The Fourth Amendment, quote, the right of the people to secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizure shall not be violated. What does this mean? It means that by establishing a trust, which is a contract, we provide additional layer of protection and insulation against the unwarranted search and seizure by the government. So at this point, we have two things that are important. Number one, the federal government has the right to print currency. And number two, we have a right to establish contracts, one of which can be a trust, to further protect our privacy. Then comes, in 1913, the 16th Amendment. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, etc., etc. This was ratified by Article 5 Convention, which created not only the federal income tax, but the Federal Reserve. Now, what is the Federal Reserve? This is where we made the wrong left turn. An Article 5 convention is a convention that's convened in order to amend or repeal an amendment to the Constitution when it cannot be done for whatever reason legislatively. So by a Article 5 Constitutional Convention, they created the federal income tax and they created the Federal Reserve. What is the Federal Reserve? Well, first, before I even get into the Federal Reserve, let's get into the federal income tax. When the federal income tax was initially established, and again it was done by convention, by Article 5 Convention, the way they got the states to agree was that the tax would only be a 7% income tax on earnings in excess of $500,000. There was only about 2,500 people in the entire country that earned over $500,000 a year. So the promise was that the tax would only be on the quote-unquote uber rich, a promise which they summarily broke, as the last 100 years points out. But what's the Federal Reserve? It's maybe the first example of the government using words to lie to us. The Federal Reserve is not federal. It's a private corporation, and there is no reserve. What the Federal Reserve does is it literally prints helicopter money. It prints and creates money out of nothing. It then lends the money to the federal government. So the federal government had to create a federal income tax to pay the interest on the money created in the basement of the Federal Reserve. And they did all this when the Constitution had provision for us to print our own money at no interest. Now, I don't want to get into the whole history of the Federal Reserve or the central bank, because the Federal Reserve is the United States Central Bank. They just chose the word Federal Reserve because it was more palatable. Now, the reason I point all of this out is because what the central banks have been doing is printing money. And by printing money, they've created inflation. And by creating more inflation and more inflation, the value of money has drifted down to virtually worthless. In 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, the goods and services that an individual could purchase at that time with $100 today would cost you $2,150. So the Federal Reserve that was created to reduce inflation has created over the last 100 years over 2,100% inflation. And in a backhanded way, that's why they've created this opportunity for us to pick up a currency like the dinar that's in a program rate, an artificially worthless rate, and then bring it back to a Basel III compliant value of over $3. But here's the problem, and this is one of the reasons why I think that they're sort of dragging their feet globally. The international community wants to create a global digital currency. Now, what does a global digital currency do? We've already had the specter of this with some of the other experimentations. For example, one of the things that they're going to create simultaneously and what they considered creating before was something called a rainbow currency. In other words, let's take the U.S. dollar, the $1 bill, the $5 bill, the 10, etc. Each bill would be a different color. Why? Because at some date they'd say, okay, this is the only currency available. So any of the old currency that people may be hoarding, black market money, dark money, whatever, they would either have to surrender to exchange into the rainbow currency, or after a certain date it would simply be worthless. If you go to Europe today, and they've sort of instituted this in a way, you could have €1 million in an EU bank, but depending upon the country you're in, you could only withdraw anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 euros a day. Now, you can, of course, write checks and conduct business and all of that, but if you want actual hard currency, you're limited to between 1,000 to 2,500 euros a day. They're trying to move us away from hard currency in order to gain control, because once all of the currency is digital, they can control everything. They certainly can't control inflows, but they can control outflows. So you'll be paid digitally. The money will go into your bank account digitally, and then they will be able to control how much of that you can remove, if at all, and it's all going to be digital. So it's a situation where we've lost control, and they probably want to get this instituted before we go to the banks to do our exchange, because remember, we hold hard currency, and what they want to do is have that currency transformed into digital currency when we go to the bank. I'm hoping they're not able to accomplish that before all of this transpires, but we have no control of that. Now, just as back in 2013, the lie was, we're only going to tax 7% of your earnings, about $500,000. The big lie with the digital currency is it's safe. We know from what's been going on with the identity theft that a digital currency will not be safe. It'll be subject to cyber attacks. It'll be subject to solar activity. It'll be subject to an EMP weapon, electromagnetic pulse weapon. So these things are not safe, and any bad players can really affect what the dollars and cents are in our digital accounts. So this is one of the reasons we want to get the currencies into tangible assets as quickly as we can. This is why we need to establish a trust whether we have currencies, pre-valued currencies or not. Because once you transition a substantial amount of your wealth to tangible assets, under the IRS code as it written now, under 643A and 643B, you're going to be able to move assets around and enjoy certain tax benefits. Now, I've stated many times before, under Section 643A and B of the code, it says that the profit from the sale or exchange of capital assets within an irrevocable trust is tax deferred. Now, because the revaluation is of such magnitude, we want a private letter ruling from the IRS and the Treasury Department to confirm what the code actually says, just as an additional protection. But the fact of the matter remains that at least you will enjoy capital gains rather than ordinary income by establishing the trust and transitioning to tangible assets. So these are the reasons why I would strongly suggest, if you have currencies, but even if you don't have currencies, to contact us to get our initial no obligation package. It has a lot of information about us, about the revaluation of currencies, but most importantly about these trusts, because this, irrespective of whether you have currencies or not, these trusts are going to protect your privacy. They're going to make it much more difficult for the government to violate your constitutional rights, which the present bunch in Washington are trying to do. They've been instituting executive orders, and I say they because in my opinion, Biden is not running the show. Executive orders, and every time they've gone to the Supreme Court, they've been shot down. So it's as though they're trying to sneak something through, or they feel that if they just drag their feet, maybe it'll take the courts a long time to rule against them, or maybe they'll get lucky and one of their Hail Marys will work. But they're doing everything they can to impinge and infringe upon our rights. And establishing your own contractual self-settled trust is one way to stop them in their tracks. If for no other reason, then they're going to go after the low-hanging fruit, the people that have not protected themselves, rather than deal with litigation from those who have exercised their constitutional right to put a wall of privacy around their personal affairs, and absent probable cause are not going to be subject to these undue warrants. So again, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this call. Those of you calling in for the first time, I would suggest you go to our call of December 1st of 2021. Those of you who are involved on a day-to-day basis with watching what's going on in Iraq, because Iraq's probably the linchpin, there is this yin and yang between the exchange rate going back to 11.90 or going to, say, a 1-to-1 with the dollar in a genuine reinstituted rate. You can go to my call of the January 19th and January 26th. For those who are calling in for the first time and would like to get our initial package, you can go to our request us an email. Go to us through our email, which is trusts with an S, unlimited LLC at gmail.com, or you can call our phone service, which is 307-274-4122, and request our initial package. We'll get that out to you as quickly as possible. It's a no-obligation package, although it does contain everything you need if you wish to proceed. After reviewing the package, you may have additional questions. You can either email us or call if you want those questions resolved. There will be no consultation fee. We will help you in every way make the best decision you can for you and your family. Again, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this call. I definitely expect to be back next week with a full call to review our program and go to a Q&A, because I'll be back on a computer I'm comfortable with rather than this laptop. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this call, being patient with me while I go through this little situation I have with my family. We will be back next Wednesday. Certainly, if something of a dramatic nature were to happen between now and then, we'll try to get an emergency email and schedule an emergency conference call. But failing that, we will be back next Wednesday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Have a great week and hang in there. Bye-bye.